understand my favorite chair is being reupholstered or something. So we'll have to struggle on in this one today. Actually, Western civilization is indebted to the Greeks for many advantages and some very profound thinking. This does not mean that the whole Grecian world was ideal, or that all the Grecians were of the highest intellectual quality. No such a society has ever existed. But, in many ways, the Greeks gave us a foundation in learning, which has become the basis for practically all Western growth, education, social and political development. First of all, the Grecians came to the conclusion that there were three basic departments of learning. The first of these departments was mathematics. The second was astronomy, and the third was music. Now, this seems like a strange mixture. It is not likely that one of our prominent physicists today will play the Stradivarius or anything of that nature. He probably has no interest in music. He might have. It's indifferent. But to these ancient people, beginning about 600 to 700 years B.C., these three were the foundations, the legs of the tripod of knowledge. They were very definitely called a tripodium, or the three things that must be known. Now, to begin with, the mathematics. The greatest of the mathematicians of antiquity were probably Pythagoras and Euclid. Both of these individuals recognized that mathematics existed on three levels, and that each of these levels was symbolical of some kind of a universal truth. In the Greek states, there were no mathematicians who did not believe in something besides mathematics. First of all, mathematics became the basis of the realization of the exactitudes of existence. Mathematics indicated that God geometrized. So the first branch of mathematics was tied to religion. It was the way in which the individual could prove for himself the immutability of the divine plan. He could learn in his own way and in his own time the magnificent exactitudes of life. And he could also theorize, at least, on the source of these exactitudes. Did a mathematical formula that extends from the known to the unknown derive itself from nothing? Was it something discovered by individuals long before they knew their own existence? Was it inherited from a savage world which did not possess it? How did we get this understanding of the exactitudes of life? Pythagoras gave the clue to the matter with his famous 47th proposition, which is attributed to Euclid but was by Pythagoras. The answer to the whole thing was very simple. The highest level of mathematics was the spiritual realization of the infinite exactitude of the divine plan and the divine purpose. In other words, the first duty of mathematics was to sustain the concept of a spiritual universe. The Greeks had no way of interpreting it any differently. They could not believe in themselves that something that was absent or lacking could produce out of itself more than itself. Therefore, the total mystery of mathematics was the discovery of these exactitudes by mental thought, carefulness, and mathematical formulas. But the end of it was that the universe is an exact structure, not only all sufficient, but all ensouled. There has to be a divine mathematician, or the material mathematical sciences could not develop. So this was the first level of mathematics. The second level of mathematics went into other considerations. the exactitudes of the universe were reflected down into the exactitudes of the human faculties. The second level of mathematics, therefore, was the arithmetic of the human mind. The mind working in exactitudes, the world knowing, a kind of realization in which the mind inclined itself inevitably toward truth. The mind had the skill, the internal resolution, and the basic root necessary to recognize the divine plan. The mind, therefore, placed itself also in the position of being the interpreter of a universal reality, bridging the interval between the universe itself and the human brain. This was the bridge. The human mind was the bridge between divine mind and mortal mind. It became a key to the possibility of every living thing becoming, in the course of infinite time, wise and good. Therefore, the mind took the infinite plan and turned it into a code for the individual, giving him the assurance, the support, the conviction, the dedication necessary to apply universal mathematics to his own existence. Now, the third level of mathematics was barter and exchange. Mathematics was necessary in order that we might have time, that we might have seasons, that we might have the adding up of the ordinary grocery bill. It placed a pattern of exactitudes upon the inferior processes of life. It helped us to have a multiplication table. It helped us to add up our bills, to provide our proper bank accounts. It also gave us the possibility of all forms of personal practices within the scope of mathematics. It gave us the ability to plan the future. It gave us the sense of our own passing years. It gave us the seasons by which we are able to sow and to reap the harvests of the earth. So this lower level of mathematics might be considered the practical use of it, the use of it to attain ends consistent with the supreme mathematics upon which it was dependent. Therefore, the practice of daily mathematics must have meaning in terms of divine mathematics. It must be only an evidence to further support the power of infinite number and the infinite tables of mathematical procedure. So mathematics became a package in itself. It brought together so many different factors, but its primary purpose was a cultivation of virtue. It was there to prove that the individual could prove to his own satisfaction that the world in which he lives is an orderly structure, that he is part of something going somewhere and achieving something, that there are no accidents or incidents which are not covered by the grand scheme of number. He was therefore to become an idealistic mathematician, never for a moment assuming that he could accept mathematics without accepting God. It was necessary to recognize that these processes, which are still in scientific research, constantly being verified or experimented with in science, all of these have their basis and their foundation and their ultimate solution in the concepts of cosmic, spiritual, divine arithmetic. This was the theoretic arithmetic of Theon of Smyrna and Theon of Alexandria. Now, the second branch of our important structure is astronomy. Now, astronomy has a very different meaning in many ways. Astronomy to the Greeks was not primarily merely an observation of the heavenly bodies. It was not enough to examine the universe. We must find answers to the question, why? Why is the universe? What is its purpose? To look through a telescope and be satisfied to weigh the chemical elements of some distant star is a blind alley. It is meaningless. We must know why that star is there. We must know what part in the great universal plan of things all living creatures, living beings, and living substances within the cosmos have meaning, have significance, and have purpose. Therefore, astronomy is a way of proving scientifically, mathematically, and through observation by telescope and other devices that the orderly universe of the mathematician is true. That every way you turn in space, there are visible exactitudes of light, of color. There is everything you can possibly imagine, from the spectrum to the so-called dark holes. And all of these things are part of the anatomy of the body of the divine. Therefore, the purpose of astronomy is likewise twofold. The highest purpose of astronomy is to add the visual recognition that the universe is meaningful, that the wonders that we can think of in the mind can ultimately be seen in space, and that everywhere throughout the entire creation there is a magnificent plan, and that this plan is made visible through countless solar systems, through countless cosmic systems, and is broken down upon Newton's prism. Everything in the universe, therefore, is a series of dynamic exactitudes of the highest possible moral quality. The morality of the universe is also to be demonstrated in the astronomical seasons, in all the processes of this great space field in which all planets, suns, moons, asteroids, and comets have their being. So the ancients naturally created also a astronomical theology. The Sabians of the Near East were star worshippers, so-called. The East Indians also recognized the stars as supreme beings and came to the inevitable conclusion that everything that exists in nature, planetary or within the body of a cell, is in some way intelligent, and that this intelligence is not necessarily innate, but is bestowed upon it by something stronger and more powerful than itself. As the human mind is dependent upon the divine mind, so every little creature anywhere in space is dependent upon the great concept of creation, and creation in turn develops along patterns of eternal evolutionary growth and unfoldment. So to the ancients, God geometrized, and God also was seated on a throne above the firmament, with the stars and the planets at his feet. This concept, therefore, was that we could develop another angle of our search for God through the study of astronomy, that we could gain confidence that the plan of things is real and adequate by observing the inevitable exactitudes in space. That these exactitudes could be accidental, it seems to be completely impossible, for there's no possible way in which a vast number of accidents can combine together to form an exact science. So this first part of astronomy again becomes theological. It becomes a way of reaching God, or reaching the God concept, and through scientific research enlarging and perfecting this concept toward the ultimate recognition of truth. Now, the second part of astronomy has to do with the various ailments, processes, and so forth that have a direct bearing upon man. In other words, the human being lives in an astronomical field, and in this astronomical field, every part of nature is reflected in his own structure. Man is therefore a microcosm, a miniature universe existing within a greater one. Man is a miniature of all things that live, and by studying the internal, following the Egyptian rule, man, seek thyself, seek to know thyself, we get the key to almost all forms of universal knowledge. Among the early alchemists and mystical writers of Europe, it was stated time and time again that the human being was the symbol of the entire process of human regeneration and the final transmutation of imperfection into the fulfillment of its own needs. Also out of this we come to the conclusion that the divine astronomy in man lays the rules for the man's life, how he is to live, how he is to think, how he is to develop the various resources that he has, teaches him to labor and to hope, teaches him to choose his profession from within himself, and using the ever unfolding aptitudes with which he has been endowed. And gradually man comes to realize that as the universe is beyond his comprehension, so his own potentials transcend his comprehension, and that within each living thing is locked a superiority which only careful thought and long and sincere effort can bring into its fulfillment. The third angle or part of astronomy becomes what we call today astrology, and the ancients were well aware of it. As the astronomy is the anatomy of the universe and the solar system, so the astrologer is seeking for the psychological structure of the universe, to discover the moods and methods of universal behavior. It is to a measure, therefore, that the physiologist studies the body and the astrologer becomes the psychologist, analyzing the various processes and forces of life. The ancients and Greeks, of course, were informed on these matters, including Pythagoras, and later in North Africa, the work that is best known to us of Claudius Ptolemy. These pioneers sought to find a way by means of which the human being could profit consciously from the great examples around him in larger space, that he could learn in some way or other to use the energies that were released upon him from the universe for the advancement of his own kind, for the perfection of his society. He began to understand that every force in nature focusing upon the planet Earth is a force for its constructiveness, that it is there to help the Earth to grow. But if this helpfulness is perverted or destroyed by mankind, then the planet, which could become better, becomes worse. If the human being, therefore, becomes a dishonorable member of society, if in the garden of the Lord he becomes a bad gardener, if he permits things to develop and unfold which mathematics should have protected him against, and which astronomy should have revealed to him the error of his ways, then he comes into a direful relationship. And these various rays that we refer to as astrological are simply the natural benevolent forces of life affecting a creature that has declared war against integrities, who is determined to have his own way in a universe in which there is only one way to go, that he is trying desperately to build his own empire in a world in which the perfect empire was built in the beginning. So that astrology becomes a searching for the principles and energies which can be used constructively, as in astrodiagnosis, in the detection of disease, as the study of planetary herbs and all that type of thing, and as many other phases, astrometeorology, the final method of calculating weather and climate. All these things are part of the philosophy based upon the concept, the basic concept of astronomy, which in turn is based upon the basic realization of mathematics. So we have these things working together very closely for the common good. Now, to this rather tight bundle of intellection, the ancients realized there had to be a release or an escape into another dimension of life. The science by itself is not enough. It can produce mentation, but mentation cannot save the human soul. It can help to develop the possibilities of life. It can contribute to our needs and our knowledge. But the individual cannot be perfect by becoming a perfect scientist. He must have other values. He must have other purposes. And the most important of all these purposes, probably, is to recognize the importance of the great emotional content which is locked within himself. This gives us the concept the ancients bestowed upon music. Music was a realization, recognition, and direct experience of harmony. That there is in the universe not a competitive structure, but a cooperative structure. That all the things by nature allowed to fulfill their own purposes will work together, live together, and harmonize in great patterns. Music, therefore, represents the music of the spheres in astronomy. It represents the marvelous tables developed by Pythagoras for universal harmonies. It shows the solar system to be a musical instrument, which was also discovered in China and India. Music becomes the refiner. It becomes the power to become strong and wise without becoming cruel and hard. It permits us to remember always the beauties of life, the kindliness of life. Music becomes the basis of harmony and is under the rulership of the divine principle of harmonia. All the good things that we know come from a measure of intellection and a measure of harmony. For instance, in science, or in astronomy, or in mathematics. What good is all this research if it doesn't make someone happier, make someone better, or help the world to have greater joy in existence? Ignorance is the source of sorrow. Wisdom is the source of intellectual light, and music is the source of emotional light and love. So to the ancients, music became the handmaiden of the principle of love, affection, and concord. It told us and tells us still the difference between concord and discord. It tells us what happens when we lose sight of the importance of the lawful pattern of music. The ancients, the Greeks, had their musical rhythms, their musical harmonies, their musical modes. These things protected the community. In those days in Greece, you could not build a building, you could not live a life without some type of contact with harmony. There had to be something more than strength and more than skill and more than knowledge, and that was a gentle humanity of inner respect and affection and regard. Now, as we face the world today, we realize that this particular factor also has been rudely disturbed. Most of the music that we now have that is so-called popular music would have been outlawed by the Greeks, not because they didn't appreciate music, but because they had to study its effects. In other words, the therapeutic value and disadvantages of music must be estimated. And how do we estimate these things? We estimate them mentally by a realization which we call common sense. We recognize and estimate them mathematically in laws of cause and effect, in the larger pattern of things, that harmonic and anharmonic intervals and rhythms can be corrected by mathematics. Most always also we have the final consideration, and that is the physical aspect, the effect of harmony and inharmony upon daily living, the effect of hard, unpleasant discords upon the minds and hearts of people. That music perverted is as dangerous as any other perversion, because it represents a vibratory factor upon which life lives or depends for its own maturity. A vibratory factor which shatters the nervous structure of the individual will not pass the intellectual examinations of the ancients. There has to be a realization that music also is a handmaiden of truth. It is the purpose of music not only just simply to make pleasant melodies, but to step over into other branches of life. Music becomes a very vital factor in architecture, and the great musical compositions are architectural structures. It becomes a great and important factor in art, in painting, in sculpturing, and in all the artistic expressions. If these are asymmetrical, if these are falsely developed, or if these are inspired by ulterior motives which are negative, the effect of these things when seen is destructive. It is not something in which you can simply say, let's forget it, because while we are surrounded with these inharmonies day and night, and constantly live in the presence of them, there is no way of escaping their influence. We are now trying to curb certain addictions which threaten the survival of our people. And all developments in art which are non-constructive are also addictions. And very often they're simply a style media of one sort or another, an effort to prove that difference is divine. Difference is only divine if it is better. So we have the music coming in through painting, through architecture, through rhythms of all kinds, through the theater, the stage, through all art and entertainment, in which we also find the elements of romance or the elements of human experience. So all of this comes under the general heading of music. Now, music differs in different parts of the world, and we are sometimes amiss to know how to estimate the musics of other people. We have to recognize, of course, that other people have different vibratory rates from our own. We have developed a rate based almost entirely upon classical culture. Some other part of the world has something different. The Chinese moon lute has its strings set to the solar system and the orbits of the planets. The great monochordium of Pythagoras was actually a single thread uniting heaven and earth, with the frets marking the orbits of all the planets. And these frets and these various divisions devised by Pythagoras are still regarded as valuable and elements in the structure of harmony. So we now have a concept of the three important factors that have to do with education, with knowledge, with the advancement of a civilization. And we realize there are three kinds of people: those who are trying to do better, those who are willing to stay the same, and those who are constantly falling below the level of their own previous achievement. These factors become again very important to us. Now, how did the ancients, the Greeks particularly, come to prepare their lives for this threefold recognition of the importance of certain sciences? It began, of course, as all ancient education did begin, in the family. The child in Greece, as a small child, was tutored by his own parents. And this tutoring was for both girls and boys. The Greeks were not a people who enslaved or ignobled their women. They were very definitely educated. And, of course, the greatest woman philosopher of all time, Hypatia of Alexandria, was of Greek origin. Actually, also, in the home, the individual was taught that he was part of a system. He was taught simply at first, but he had the support of all the neighbors, all the members of the community, and even the priesthoods and the higher cultures. He was taught to believe in the reality of a plan, that he was part of a structure, that he was born into this world with opportunities, and if he tried to break or escape these opportunities, they were suddenly turned into responsibilities and captured him anyway. It was very important, therefore, in the early life to become aware that he must be a mathematician, astronomer, and at the same time a musician. Every effort was made to drive these points home to him in the very beginning, to realize that there was no such a thing as a universe of physical matter separated from something higher. This world as a material structure was not a ship without a rudder wandering about on the sea of space. Every part of the universe was understandable, and it was the duty of the young person to develop as much of this understanding as he was capable of accepting. If you get a little further along in this, the Greeks used tutors to educate their young. These tutors were professional educators, and they were the ones that the philosophers usually looked down on and called sophists. Now, tutors are very dangerous things, and also we must realize that tutorship as such is a dangerous thing. Now, in our present way of life, these tutors are represented by traditional educational patterns. What we might term the grammar school would correspond with the tutors, with those who were supposed to advance the student to the point where he would be able to associate himself with some brilliant teacher. These tutors, therefore, were looked down upon by the philosophers. Why? Because they never grew. They never knew more. They clung completely to the old. They followed the traditional patterns, and even back in Greece, they were emphasizing the importance of becoming successful in the physical world. These tutors, therefore, were regarded as materialists. They were regarded as inadequate, but they were accepted for the teaching of the teenager as to the common problems of his language, his history, and the various relationships with society, the laws of Athens, the laws of Greater Greece, the countries that were friendly or enemy to the Athenians, and such matters. But they were the ones that sort of made an Athenian out of a Greek. Other communities made members of their own type. There were teachers that made Sparta's people Spartans. It was to adjust them to the culture in which they live. It gave them the foundation of the familiar and made it possible for them to drift through life without doing anything of great importance, and therefore, in this way, escaping the more painful interludes of those who try to think. After the tutors, the sophists, came, then there was the main problem. And that problem was the schools of scholarship. Most of the Greeks were educated under the direction of individuals. The school of Athens contained the great philosophical elect of its time. The school of study and understanding was broken into groups who gathered at various places, some in the Lyceum, some in the Academy, but all were teachers with a small group of disciples. This was very similar to the guru system in India. But these teachers were selected because of their outstanding ability, of the possibility through them of the young person receiving an extraordinary enlightenment. It was always the duty of these professional philosophers to make sure that the individual, if possible, could live his span without hurting himself desperately, without doing things he would regret for the rest of his life, or getting himself into involvements he could not escape. On a certain occasion, a man brought his son to one of these philosophers and said to the philosopher, "What is the advantage of allowing you to educate my son?" The philosopher was quiet in a moment, and he said, "Well, if I educate your son, and he goes to the games," those are these things like the Olympiads, and becomes a spectator of them, he will not be one stone sitting on another. In other words, when he sits down, he won't be just another rock on the chair. The man who was putting him there kind of thought for a moment, and thought that sounded reasonable, so he allowed the boy to go with this particular teacher. But the opener of the eyes was also known in Egypt. It was the person who began to give you the truth, began to relieve you from the adolescent delinquencies or restrictions of the sophists. It was the possibility that the disciple could remain for years with his master. and become fully informed as to the principles and teachings of the school for which he had associated his life. The Socratic school was one, the Aristotelian school was another the Platonic Academy. These were all schools. Plato had intended to become a political figure in the life of Greece, but after a little experiment he realized that the government was incapable of accepting a profound philosophical understanding of its own responsibilities. So he retired from politics forever, opened an academy where he had disciples, and created a little world of his own, teaching those who were ready to learn, and in the course of years leaving behind him a message that has continued its vitality to the present day. Though, therefore, in these schools various things were taught, and in order to get a real understanding of the Greek culture, it's really almost necessary to study the works of several of these different schools. Some of them were more or less at loggerheads. They didn't all agree on the same things, but most of them had some type of reconciling intelligence. They recognized that down on the level of particulars you could fight to the end of time. But as you ascended from one level of learning to another, you came closer together, and in the recognition of the reality of truths, you became completely adjusted to all others of similar level. So all learning led to the state of learning, and always the learning itself was a solution to something. It had to give the individual a larger vision than he would otherwise have possessed. Actually, the schools, therefore, developed various levels, and many of the professors and teachers changed their own points of view as they went along. One of the most famous schools, of course, was the school of Socrates. In this school, Socrates was, in a sense, the mentor of Plato. He had a number of very close disciples, and a very wise and remarkable person. He had his own peculiarities, however, and he was quite an individualist. Socrates would have been able to live out probably his full life if he had not objected to the idea that a good teacher could do more for a child than a bad parent. And this is what cost him his life. Plato said he would gladly pay the fine that was exacted for this break with the Athenians' policy. But Socrates refused to accept the payment of the fine, because he said, if they want to work this sentence on me, I will not break the law of Athens by attempting to escape or to do anything else. So he died for his conviction. And his last words to his disciples were something to the effect that all his life he had studied, wondered, thought as to whether there was life after death or whether there was not. So he said, it's now good. I go to answer that question. If there is life after death, I shall live on. If there is no life after death, I shall cease. And whichever way it is, I accept it with complete acceptance and willingness. So this type of thinking was quite prevalent among the Greek thinkers, a thinking which was always based upon some deep conviction about reality. Another point in Greek philosophy that is interesting was the consistent low grading of wealth. The Greeks did not really believe in wealth. They regarded it as forever a testimony to what was wrong. Every individual who had more than he needed became less than he had been before. And in selfishness and effort to gain stature or to advance socially, the individual denied the real reason for his own existence. So, on one occasion, someone said to Plato, "Why is gold such a pale metal?" And Plato replied, "It is because it is frightened to death of the people who are going to own it." And this was more or less the vision of his time. The philosopher Aristippus, who was rather an iconoclast in his own right, was on a ship one day, and listening by accident, he heard that the crew of the ship was pirates, and that they were going to wait till night to take his belongings, his box of money that he had with him, and throw him overboard. So when the dawn rose the next day, Aristippus was sitting out on the bowsprit of the boat with his strong box in his lap, and he was dropping the money into the ocean, one coin at a time. And they cried out, "What are you doing?" He said, "It is better that this money perish for Aristippus than that Aristippus perish for this money." And this was the Greek point of view largely. Wherever wealth interfered with growth, they were against it. Wherever wealth became a blind alley, wherever the individual seeking luxury sacrificed integrity, this, the Greeks said, was wrong. And it became important to them that these things should be understood because of this relationship to the three basic forms of knowledge. If something permanently interfered with the quest for truth, this delay was dangerous to the perfection of the human soul. Therefore, to have enough is correct. On one occasion, Epicurus, who is of course regarded as the source of the word Epicurean, which generally now means a person who eats very specially excellent food. He is judge of food. Epicurus, it is said, once invited a number of his friends to a banquet. Of course, they all accepted with great joy. When they got there, there was on the table 2 or 3 loaves of stale bread and a couple of pitchers of sour milk. They all looked at him astonishment. "Why is this banquet we were promised? Where is the feast?" "Well," he said, "if the truth were known, a piece of dry bread and a glass of sour milk is enough, and enough is as good as a feast." And they finally discovered it. But the idea that all these ancient peoples were living in luxury was not factually true. Most of those who are remembered today were not luxurious. Many of them, like Socrates, had no house for many years and lived in a barrel in the Greek Lyceum. Later he had a little hut or cottage that was assigned to him. And one of his disciples said to him, "Master, you're all alone in this little house and you're very old. What will happen? If you die, who will bury you?" And Socrates said with a smile, Diogenes said with a smile, "The man who wants this house will bury me." There was a lot of wit in those days, and much of it has gotten into the permanent collections of human wisdom. They were not a heavy lot. The Greek philosophers did not believe in wandering about ponderously. They did not believe in long words that no one could understand. They did not believe in old texts that no one would read. To the philosophers, education was a living experience. The disciples gathered with the teacher by the roadside, and there they together studied life. And they studied it in the presence of the old trees and the little ponds and the flowers and the birds. They lived close to nature. And because they were close to nature, they did not believe in hate. They did not believe that the individual had to regard life as a terrible punishment for some kind of a sin that he did not even remember. We are not here to be punished. We are here to grow. Every form of life is here to grow. And those who know this grow joyously. Those who resent this and attempt to survive against the codes of life have misery. And wherever there is misery, philosophy says, here is a wonderful invitation to correct the cause. And to correct the cause means to stop doing the things that make us miserable. and realize with the Grecians that the gods intended humanity to be a happy, cheerful creation, worthy of the divine power that fashioned them, and that every individual who goes into some kind of a negative attitude is a disappointment to the gods. They expect better, and they therefore keep on prodding a little until they get what they want, and they will get it. Another Greek said on one occasion, I think it was Aesop in fact, that the principal work of the gods is to cast down the great. Those of simple life, of common people, the gods lift up. Those of great pride and wealth, the gods have a tendency to cast down. So these things not only developed a great philosophy for these people, but it also strongly influenced things that were to follow. With the beginning of the Christian era, we have a great deal of development of Christian principles based upon Greek learning. The oldest known existing manuscripts of the Bible, both Testaments, Old and New, are in Greek. Nothing earlier has ever been found. Actually, therefore, most of these were probably written or compiled in Alexandria, in Egypt, which was a great Greek civilization in North Africa. We also know that Platonism, Neoplatonism, Pythagoreanism, and Neopythagoreanism, and Gnosticism were all heavily influenced by the Greek. And these various systems, variously modified with the passing of time, have become largely incorporated into the Christian way of life. The essential principles of the Greeks concerning character and conduct are the same that we still admire, even if we do not emulate them. So from the Greeks we also have another pattern that is important, I think, and that is productivity. The individual lives to do something. It is always possible for a person to make some major improvement, and religion, therefore, is proven by growth. The individual who is better than he was before is keeping his faith better than he did before. All religion is growth, the growth by means of which the divine in the human being is released into society. Growth makes each person a prophet, makes each individual a teacher. Growth unfolds the potential that is within every person. This potential may be greater or smaller, but it is there. The potential may only help an individual to cook a better meal or to design a better house, but it will still be an improvement. It will be something gained, something added, something contributed to the common good. Therefore, every individual should make every effort possible, according to Greek thinking, to die a better person than he was born. This is quite an interesting thought if we give it care. Most people think that the individual was innocent and stainless and sinless when he's born, and gradually fell into corruption. That is not quite true according to the Greek philosophy, because they do not believe that the individual coming into this world is brand new. They believe that he comes here with an unpaid debt or a need for certain further involvement. And if he has been a good person before, and has been a philanthropist or generous or thoughtful person before, he will want to extend this further. So from early life he may develop tendencies which would indicate what he could do and can do to make a better world for himself and others. But whatever it is, each person is morally required to grow during the period of life. If he doesn't grow through the period, he is not only wasting his time, but wasting the common resources upon which we all depend for growth. If he does nothing for his life, nothing with himself, but the common things we associate today, then he is simply an expense in nature. He is costing the earth more than he is giving back. He is going gradually into a kind of psychological bankruptcy by the wasting of the resources upon which he should build a better life. If he is born with one unit of power or authority, he can become capable of multiplying it, adding to it, and leaving this life a better person than he found himself when he came in. This growth problem has always been a more or less a touchy subject. Growth nearly always interferes with selfishness. Growth nearly always interferes with the kind of notoriety that most people like. Very few people really want to be remembered because they grew spiritually. They want to be remembered because they got rich, they got famous, they got a nice fat contract or something of that nature. Success to the average person is physical success, a physical opulence. To the Greek, success came when the individual discovered the secret of the squaring of the circle or the triangulation of the right angle. He was looking for things that he could turn around and use to solve problems. There's a story of one philosopher who was hard at work when an invading army broke into his house. He was there figuring out a mathematical calculation, and a soldier came in with a drawn sword to kill him. He looked up mildly from his calculation and said, "If it's all right, will you wait a few minutes till I finish this diagram?" The soldier is said to have backed away, unable to understand the situation. But actually, in life, we have responsibilities to grow and to be part of a world that is getting better. Now, some people have trouble in getting better, but it's not all their own fault. It has been largely a fault of circumstances. The young person of Greece started in by recognizing the great institutions of Athens and the other Athenian states. He stood in the presence of the great sanctuaries. He stood before the figure of the Olympian Zeus. He saw the marvelous rituals and rites which were the joy and glory of Greece, a glory that caused many Roman emperors to come there, simply to see the magnificence of the dedication to the divine plan. Growing up in this atmosphere in which everyone else was at least respectful of realities, that the great joy of life was to be in the presence of these beauties and these joys, it was a different thing. These young people could grow up with a greater likelihood of being dedicated to useful purposes. We know now that there's a great excitement, for example, about the Olympic Games, that there have been things happening that were very disquieting and indicated wrongdoing in the part of athletes and so on. Well, the Greeks had their Olympic Games, and the way that led to the great Colosseum was it was lined with tablets on each side. And if any athlete performed an error, an intentional crime, or was unfair, unreasonable, or used any means to win that was not right, his name was carved on a stone and stood up by the entranceway to the Colosseum, and he was held to be a detriment to society, and his name was perpetuated for his misdeed. This type of thing would never happen today, but at the same time, it was something that the young Athenian grew up with. He also attended certain other festivals which were intended primarily for the learned. He saw a crowd of maybe thousands of people pick up a poet on their shoulders and carry him triumphantly through the streets of Athens because he had written a poem that was outstanding. The poem was good. He was not famous because of a cheap poem, but the whole population recognized the great poet as equivalent to greatness in any other field. A man might run a race and win. A man might write a poem and win, and both were equal, because both were exceptional in some respect. This type of thinking has sort of faded out of our lives. And as it faded away, there were more and more compromises between the integrities of nature and the concepts of ancient thinking. Today we have a strong scientific body of people who are trained in sciences and who have built upon the Greek foundations vast laboratory experiments and based upon Greek principles have put ships into space. All of this is remarkable, and these people are held in great esteem for their skill, their courage, and their intelligence. But unless they fulfill the Greek requirement, they are not completely what they ought to be. For you can ask each one of these scientists, each one of these inventors, each one of these research men, do you love humanity sufficiently to do all this work for nothing and simply turn it into only one type of thing, something that will advance peace, harmony, brotherhood, insight, and the necessities of life for all people? Will you devote your life and all your research finds to find a way to end poverty or reduce crime or cure suffering without thought or challenge of reward? If that was our thought that we have now, as it was in the clinics of Hippocrates, we might then say that these people might be worth a very special consideration. The individual who gives all gains all, in a strange way. But today we are not thinking through to the source of things, and because of that we have not found the place for the divine plan among the archives of the learned today. We know there are many people who appreciate these things. We realize that philosophies involving spiritual growth are becoming more common and more available all the time. The orthodoxies of the past are more or less breaking down, and those that are essentially true are being dignified and elevated. But still, we live in a world in which our mathematics has not yet found God. We're not really looking for him. It is assumed that he doesn't exist. Or if he does, he is where no one can understand him, no one can ever find him, and no one has any right to depend upon him for anything. The fact of the matter is, everyone has the duty to depend upon ultimate life for everything, whether we know it or not. The food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we contaminate, all these things belong to a power greater than ourselves. They belong to an eternal principle of truth. They belong to the great powers that rule the world. And it is very definitely important that we begin to think in these terms and meet some of the problems of daily life. Now, Platonic philosophy itself is a rather interesting thing. Plato was a man who lived to be just about 81 years, and therefore he completed the great climacteric of the ancients. When he reached around 78, 79, he became mentally tired. He had taught all his life. He had very strong disciples, but he was having trouble with Aristotle, who finally walked out and left him. And he was also constantly criticized and condemned, and he was too tired to answer back. But finally, before his passing, Plato made a great adjustment, which very few people know about or have thought about, and that is that he came to the simple conclusion that all knowledge in every branch and in every feeling exists for one purpose only, that we may find God. He became a mystic, a very powerful mystic, and the mysticism which consummated his career was preserved for us by Proclus, the Platonic descendant, in his famous work on the theology of Plato. Plato turned in the end from philosophy to theology. He said that, or felt that in making this turn was not a reduction, was not an evasion of philosophy, and was not against philosophy. For he decided that science, philosophy, and the arts all have the same purpose, that the individual shall come to know the eternal source of life, love it, respect it, and live to serve it. This is not exactly the same thinking that is in his work, The Republic, or other essays which he compiled, but it has become what his closest disciples realized to be tremendously important, and became the basis of the Neoplatonism of Alexandria under Plotinus and other Neoplatonists, Iamblichus and Ammonius Saccas. The great work of the Platonic school, therefore, was consummated in the fact that philosophy is the handmaiden of religion. That no matter how wise you become, you can never be safe until love takes over. Up to that time, existence will always remain precarious. And there is no advantage, no skill, no certainty in debating and arguing these matters. There is no way in which one individual can explain to another the full mystery of life. Each one must find it for himself in his own way. But through philosophy, which joins the mind to imponderables, mathematics, which brings the mind into the certainties of science, and music and art, and the arts in general, all these help the individual to mature his own life until at last he can place his faith completely in the hands of God. Pythagoras and his disciples always danced and sang together at dawn. And we are told that Socrates, in spite of the fact he was not exactly a beautiful person physically, having a tendency to be a hunchback and also to be short-legged and so forth, until he looked more like a gnome or the old deity Silenus than he did like a philosopher. But Socrates didn't care how he looked. It was the way he felt that counted. So he went out in the morning also and danced about with his disciples. There are reports from outside areas that the dance was not perfect, but nobody cared, least of all Socrates. He had no pride as we know it. He simply felt that there were things to be done and that he was going to try and do them. And he did them to the rest of his life. But anyway, the point that we need to make now, I think also, is that the type of philosophy that was developed by the Greeks through their sciences and their arts was a philosophy of basic happiness. In other words, Socrates wasn't unhappy when he died. He was perfectly content, because all of these things are simply interludes. The moment you get a deep enough footing in the realities of life, fears cease. There's no longer anything to be really terribly unhappy about. The only thing we can do if something is wrong and try and fix it. If we come to a person in grief, we try to console and comfort them. And if we have moments of grief ourselves, we will in due time console ourselves from the resources within ourselves. In the meantime, we will go on living as happily, constructively, and even humorously as we can. The Greeks were great humorists. They had some of the wittiest stories that have ever been known. And the most delightful part has always been that they were so definitely inspired by a philosophical understanding. Diogenes and Plato had a little feud on, because Diogenes insisted on thinking that Plato considered himself to be a superior person, and be a little snobbish and so on. And of course that was worse than heresy as far as Diogenes was concerned. And one day Plato got himself a new cloak. Where it came from and how he got it, we don't know. But it was a nice-looking cloak, and it was long enough so that the tail of it brushed on the ground. Diogenes walked along behind him for a while, and when they got to a muddy spot, he jumped up and down on the tail of Plato's cloak. And he said, "Thus I step on Plato's pride." Plato turned to him and said, "Diogenes, yes, and how proud you are that you have done it." this type of humor has been very famous and very telling and always a delight, because it shows that these minds never got soggy. It's very hard to imagine a Greek philosopher who was ever soggy in his thinking. He might have all kinds of strange and interesting beliefs, but he was always a human being. He was always a person who could see the light side of things, could make the best of situations, and could turn the edge of something to make everybody feel good about it. So, and on another occasion, there was a philosopher sitting in a little tavern that was probably the 300 or 400 BC version of the modern hot dog stand. He was sitting there eating something that was equivalent to one of our quick sandwiches, and along came one of the archons. The archons, of course, were the leaders of the state. They had a little something to do with the idea of senators or something of that nature. But they were the rulers of the Athenian Commonwealth. And this archon came by looking very sedate, very smug, and very self-important. And the old philosopher sitting at the lunch counter turned to him and said, "Hail, brother, come and have sandwich with me." He looked at there's something worse than Macmillan ever looked, and said, no, and he turned his head away and wouldn't go and join the philosopher with his sandwich. So the philosopher called after him, "Are you not the servant of the people?" And the archon said, "Yes." And then this philosopher said, "If you are a servant of the people, are you too good to eat where your masters eat?" Now, it's not just certain what happened as a result of that, but it is supposed to have quieted the situation for the moment. So there are all kinds of delightful things that have come down to us from these very wise and very witty people. And I think to try to understand the situation in terms of our present thinking, I believe that one or two things should happen. Maybe they will, they probably will, because man is growing regardless of the unfortunate things that are done to him as he tries to grow, things that are interfering with his growth. I think that each individual should be taught that to learn is always an invitation to a larger dimension of insights and understanding. The child who learns the multiplication table should not come to the conclusion that its only purpose is to add up his grocery bill. He should learn to know that everything he learns is a fragment of the great unknown completeness which we are all seeking. Everything that we learn should be used to increase learning and not merely to make things more convenient in our daily relationships. It doesn't mean that they cannot be convenient, but that is not the end. The individual who gets a graduation mark even from a grammar school, but does not have at least a feeling, an instinct that tells him that what he is learning and what he has learned has a meaning greater than merely the process of trying to graduate so he can get a job. All these things are doorways. Everything we learn is a doorway. The more we fail to learn, the more we keep the doors locked. Every simple thing that comes to us in the daily existences is a symbol, an emblem, a significator of something greater. That all things go to prove in the end the reality of one thing. And that one thing is the massive glory of the plan to which we belong. Somewhere we must finally realize that we are uniquely favored by some mysterious power that has given us the right and the ability to seek truth, worship and venerate God, and live together in peace, contentment, and amity. These things are possible. These are the rewards we are seeking. But before we can gain these greater ends, we must gradually outgrow the false ends which we have substituted for them. There is no crime in being of comfortable means, but this is not the great virtue. The virtue is to grow. What we have, we will have to leave behind. What we are is eternal for us. So we must do something for the eternity. We must try in one way or another to become suitable to a greater dimension of existence. And I think the Greeks were, of all the people we know, were the best fitted at that. They had very little negative theology. They had really no worry much about hell or damnation. It wasn't part of their philosophy. They did not fear truth. They did not fear God. They would like, rather, to venerate, to accept and understand. The great figures that they created for their shrines and temples became symbols of living power, of living beings. And this quest for them, the quest for the living beings, went on through the great schools of learning which the Greeks developed. This Grecian system went finally a little bit into Rome, but did not really stay there too well. The Romans were not of this mind at all. From the Romans we may have developed some of the things that we consider as practical. Now there seems to be a great question as to what is practical. Whether it is practical to go as the Romans did to conquer the world, or whether it is better to do the old Greek method of conquering yourself. But in any respect, the Romans, for a time at least, had a certain veneration for the Greeks. Many of the Roman families had Greek tutors for their children, and particularly in the failing days of Rome, when it became obvious that things had all gone bad, the Romans became more interested in the Greek philosophies and in the Greek tradition, especially in Alexandria and Athens. As to the problem of the Greek ethics, the mystery system really lived and survived the collapse of the Roman Empire and the final fall of Greece itself. Any person, for instance, who was suspected of a crime or of a misdemeanor was refused admission into the mysteries. Everyone had to tell the full and honest story of his life if he sought to enter a sanctuary devoted to religion. He had to admit all the little mistakes that he had made, all the little crimes that he had created for others. Perhaps this was the beginning of what we called for centuries the confessional. He had to confess. If he did not confess, he was not acceptable. And it became interesting in one way or another because many Romans, all Greeks, who were accused of secret crimes or misdemeanors, placed the matter before the mysteries. In other words, if they were being accused of dishonesty, they might go to the temple and ask to be initiated. The temple would make its own examination of every detail of the case. It would never tell what it found. But if the individual had been guilty of any evil action of importance, he would be refused. If, however, this person, having appealed to the mysteries, was accepted, then the legislative system and the legal system dismissed all charges against him, because it was assumed that in the state mysteries, if he had made any prevarication of any kind, the temple would be responsible for discovering it, and had means to do so, including probably extrasensory perception. So if he passed that test, any crime or case against him was discontinued. Nero had a great desire to be an initiate. He went to Athens, but when he heard the rules, he went back to Rome. He was rejected. And it was something even in those days, for Athens at that time was under the control of Rome. It was interesting that at that time Greece refused to accept as a candidate the Emperor of Rome. But it shows the way in which, for most part, their whole system was developed. They tried very, very hard to make it true and factual. In the course of so doing, they made many discoveries relating to common personal affairs, which are worth mentioning perhaps. Lycurgus, for example, was a disciplinarian. He said there's only one way to keep a country healthy, and that is to make sure that it keeps the rules. And also, to keep a country healthy, it must respect the rules. And it must also establish these rules so firmly that the government itself cannot break them. If the leaders are corrupted, the people will not stand. If the leaders keep their own rules completely and exactly, and discipline their lives in principles of integrity and courage, the government will survive. Well, there's a thought that has come down for a long time that perhaps has meaning more and more to us. We are beginning to see the very problems that the Greeks feared and tried to prevent. But of course they were gone long ago, and the changing habits and practices of the world no longer remembers them very clearly. I had the privilege of representing Greece in the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. And at that time, through our good friend, the Archbishop, later Patriarch, Athenagoras I, we gave a summary on Greek philosophy before the entire group of several thousand persons who attended the session. And that we largely emphasized the importance of Greek thought in the regulation of modern Greek affairs in the United States, and also the importance of the philosophical Platonic discussion of government and the rulerships of peoples. That Plato was one of the first to advocate or delineate a proper government, and his procedures have never yet been questioned. The Greek community seemed to enjoy the whole procedure, and it gave me an opportunity to point out that while we are looking for background history to defend our present action, we should look where some of the better history is, not on the wars with Napoleon and Caesar or the conquests of Alexander, but in the system of scientific, philosophical, and religious integration, which for many centuries gave the world over 600 immortal thinkers, the greatest single group of enlightened human beings of which we have record. And it all began with the understanding and the background philosophy that the individual must believe in a divine power at the source of life and must bind his conduct to the laws of that power as they are revealed to him through the operating laws of nature. If you can come to these conclusions and apply them, you will find that the government that existing forever in space must be obeyed, and that man will never make an enduring government that differs from or varies from the government of the eternal plan. This, I think, the Greeks have told us, and I think a lot of people are beginning to appreciate it. Thank you very much.